Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's hot, it's hard, it's rock, and it's underground. Today we welcome surprise guest Mick Jagger. No, not Mick Jagger. Today we're talking geothermal energy opportunities. My name's Guy Dauncey. I'm based on Vancouver Island in Western Canada on the traditional lands of the Snuneymuxw First People. I'm an author, an organizer, founder of the BC Sustainable Energy Association and of the West Coast Climate Action Network, and soon to be published author of the new book, The Economics of Kindness. Geothermal Opportunities is the third installment of the Canada West Forum Society's energy series. It began with Powering the Future, an overview of energy in British Columbia, and continued with Harnessing Wind Energy. Today's forum will be followed by examinations of solar power and energy conservation, which the International Energy Agency calls the first fuel. Geothermal energy, underground, hard rock, is reliable, low carbon, and available, yet it remains a marginal player in most systems. Today we're asking, is geothermal energy being overlooked? And if so, what will it take to make it a major new force in low carbon energy transitions? Our guest speakers today are Charlotte Adams, Alex Tu, Roland Thorne, and Malcolm Hislop, and I'll introduce each in turn when we get to them. So we'll start with Charlotte, coming to us from England. Charlotte is the CEO of the National Geothermal Centre in the UK, established to accelerate the sector through expertise, policy influence, and investment. She brings extensive experience across academia, government, and industry. Charlotte, take us underground. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Guy, and good morning, everybody. It's afternoon here, so I'm coming to the end of the day just as you start yours, but I thank you greatly for the invitation to join you and be with you today. As Guy has already introduced me, I'm from the National Geothermal Centre, so I'd like to give you some insights into the UK geothermal scene, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll all have about geothermal more widely, both in terms of what you're doing and what we're doing. And just going back to Guy's original point, is geothermal overlooked? I feel it is. It's something I've been working on for 25 years. And my background is in hydrogeology and comes from mining. And my interest in geothermal started when I was taking samples of mine water, both above and below ground, realizing that they were warm, saying to people, couldn't this be a fuel source? But at that time, the UK had plentiful supplies of gas from our continental shelf reserves. And people were just like, who is this crazy woman that's talking about using mine water for heating homes? Why would we do that when we've got all this gas? Now we're in a different situation. And the Geothermal Centre was established 2 years ago as a not-for-profit national entity. And we're trying to make the case for geothermal, and picking up on some of the points that Guy's already mentioned. Geothermal is available everywhere. We're making the point that you don't need to have volcanoes or significant tectonic activity to have useful geothermal resources. It's low carbon, and it's got a key role, particularly in heat decarbonisation, and that's particularly relevant for the UK. Most of our resources are sorted, aligned well with heat production rather than power production, although we have switched on our first 3 megawatt geothermal electricity plant in February this year, down in the south of England in Cornwall, which is a really exciting project done by Geothermal Engineering. If you want to find more about that, I can share links, or you can have a look for yourselves online. There's opportunities to create jobs and keep businesses in the UK, and also create new business opportunities through selling heat and putting in heat networks and all of the ancillary stuff that goes with geothermal projects. But also by driving costs down of people's energy. We feel that's really important, both for people domestically in their homes and also for people in their businesses as well. And that links to the potential to massively improve energy security. And I'll share some slides on that in a second. So I'll not say too much more about that. Geothermal is also technology ready. So it's something we can do now. I worked on a large project which delivers 6 megawatts of heat from historically abandoned mines in the northeast of England. That's been operational for 3 years now, and it only took us 3 years to get that going. So it was a big heat network scheme with all the boreholes, the energy centres. That was delivered within 3 years, which is unusual, but proves that it can be done. So just to give you a bit of context on how the UK gets its energy at the moment, and particularly I'm focusing on gas because I'm talking a lot here about heat decarbonisation, and that's kind of where we're mainly coming from. So we're quite, since for over 20 years now, we have been a net importer of gas in the UK, getting about 40% of it via a single pipeline from Norway, which is from the Ormen Lange gas field, which is depleting. And though it's not got a closure date, the production curve from there shows that that field is in decline. We get 39% from the UK continental shelf, which is also declining and expecting to cease production by the end of this decade, if not early the next one. And then we get between 50 to 20%, depending on which year it is, of our gas as LNG, which is compressed and comes from places as far afield as Peru and Qatar. And you can see on this chart here that 15% of LNG that we get is our most polluting form of gas. So that accounts for 46% of our carbon emissions when we're actually burning that gas. And not only is it carbon intense, which you can obviously imagine because it has to be compressed and shipped around the world, it's flipping expensive. And that's what the next slide will show. So you can see the massive spike in here and what the UK was paying for gas. And the 2022 year was when there was the Ukraine invasion. And we can see there that in the UK, we kind of paid £50 billion in total to import gas. Half of that went on LNG, half of that went on the pipeline gas. So as well as having all of those vulnerabilities associated with supply from outside the UK, you've also got the risks of geopolitical shocks. And now we find ourselves in that situation again presently. So we're making the case that when you compare some of the recent work that's been done in the UK on the levelized costs for geothermal, and there's a very big document on that that looks at all different types of geothermal. If anyone's interested, again, I can put that in the chat or share it with people. But if you look at those costs, it looks that geothermal could be a lot cheaper to do. And we did this work before we were in the current crisis we find ourselves in now. And we're making the case, how long do we want to roll the dice on our energy security? Or, how soon do we want to take back control? And we find ourselves 4 years later back in that same situation with high fossil fuel prices. Obviously, that's affecting oil prices as well as gas, but that's the focus on what we're talking about today. So we think that with the amount of heat that we import, or the gas that we import as LNG and use that for heat, that aligns really well in terms of terawatt hours with what we need for our heat demand in the UK. But that would need probably the scheme I talked about that I delivered in Northeast England. We probably need another 2,000 of those in the next few decades. But we can save significant sums and improve our energy security vastly by developing geothermal in-house rather than reliance on these imports that are going to get ever more competitive as time goes forwards. We've set targets for where we'd like to see geothermal in the UK by 2050. We are aware we're behind many other countries, such as the US for electricity, China for heat, and closer to home, France, Germany, and the Netherlands are all much further than ourselves. But there's lots of reasons for doing geothermal, as I've highlighted here. And I think what it will take, we have the technology that's proven. We've got most different types of geothermal in the UK, apart from the volcanic schemes, obviously. And the technology's there, the people are there to do it, the knowledge is there, we have the resources, but it's the deployment environment for us that's not yet right. So we need better government support, probably some incentives to help boost and kickstart the geothermal sector. And we also need changes to things like planning and regulation to allow geothermal to be progressed more quickly so that we can quickly respond to these energy crises that we find ourselves into. So that's a very brief snapshot of some of the work that we're doing. And I'll hand back to Guy to listen to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's a great beginning. So Alex, our next speaker is Alex 2. Alex has been, and if you can stop showing the slides, Charlotte, then we can
yes,
all see each other.
Okay. It's just not letting me.
Right. There we go. So Alex has been with BC Hydro in British Columbia for more than 20 years and is focused on meeting future demands for electricity. Alex has tracked geothermal developments closely He's now evaluating how BC Hydro might be able to employ these technologies. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Guy. Boy, when you mentioned I've been in a hider for 20 years, it reminds me about 20 years ago, Guy, you and I would have met when I had done some brief work on your policy team on the
That's
NGO
why
that on Vancouver Island,
That's when I was working with the BC Sustainable Energy
BC
Association.
Sustainable
It
Energy
rings a bell. We
Association.
were plugging geothermal hard, yes.
That's right. So it's lovely to see you again. And hello, everybody. I'm in the long-term planning team here at BC Hydro, and in particular, my task is to try to inform BC Hydro about the sorts of resource options we have to meet both our energy and capacity needs for the long term. So, in particular, I try to populate an inventory of all the wind resources, or solar resources, or hydro resources, as well as geothermal or energy efficiency and demand-side management resources we have around the province, so that we can set a long-term strategy that's appropriate to either acquire this resource or that resource, or build this transmission or that transmission, in order to ensure that over the long term, BC Hydro has enough of the two products that BC Hydro supplies. That's energy, so that's the kilowatt hours you consume over the year, as well as capacity. That is the ability to provide reliable electricity when you need it, primarily around the winter season during the winter season peak, where everybody has their turkeys in the oven and their lights and heating on, which is our maximum peak load in BC. So the two challenges that Guy introduced at the beginning is geothermal being overlooked, and what will it take to develop it? I think here in BC, I have heard the accusation that's been overlooked for many years. Canada, very famously, is the only country on the Pacific Rim of Fire where geothermal resources are known to be very strong. We're the only jurisdiction without geothermal power production. And I'll highlight power production because that's the only geothermal resource that I'm interested in as I plan for the entire integrated system. So I'm looking for larger electricity-based resources of a scale that can move the needle for our customers across BC. So I'm primarily interested in the large geothermal power production, the sort of thing you'll see in the geysers or Nevada in the States, or increasingly in Indonesia or other largely volcanic regions. Like I said, I think the accusation that's been overlooked is a common one because we don't have any geothermal here in BC. When we think about what we have in BC today, we're primarily large hydro, which you could say is a direct competitor for geothermal in a lot of ways. Both provide reliable, dependable capacity as well as energy over the course of the year. Large hydro provides about 80% of the electricity in a province, and more than 90% of the capacity, and the remaining energy is provided by small IPPs. Increasingly, those are wind, but we have a large number of run-of-river resources, biomass resources, but we're primarily a large hydro system. And because I think the question of is it overlooked really depends on, well, what are we looking at instead? If I look at the last 20 years, it's been energy efficiency here in BC. Because our load has not been growing very quickly, it means we haven't had to add a lot of new resources. And by continuing to push energy efficiency or demand side management measures over the last 20 years, we've been able to continue to meet our load without adding significant new resources. As we all know, we're at a transition point today through electrification, as well as the crypto and Bitcoin and AI revolution we're seeing. So the load is growing for the first time very rapidly, and we are having to look for new resources. So I think this is now the right time to ask, is geothermal being overlooked? And we have in BC, of the large conventional type, probably around 700 megawatts of large geothermal capability. And we know that because geothermal was not overlooked by BC Hydro going back about 40 years. An interesting history here in BC, at the time of the oil price shocks in the late 1970s, BC Hydro was looking for new resources because we thought, unlike the rest of North America, it looked like gas and coal was not going to be the direction to go. So we did engage in a fairly deep dive at the time in geothermal resources in BC. We worked with the federal government as well to inventory the geothermal resources across the province, and we highlighted really that there were a handful of globally premier geothermal resources in BC. The two best ones are probably in a location in the Garibaldi mountain region, near to Pemberton or near Whistler for those who love to ski, and another fairly large conventional geothermal resource in the far northwest around Mount Edziza, quite far away from our existing transmission. And at the time, we didn't really think about it in this way, but now we do. Very large low temperature geothermal resource in the oil and gas area of the northeast of the province. Not nearly as good a geothermal resource, but something to think about in the modern era. When in the mid 1980s, BC Hydro invested about $30 million at the time to drill wells in Pemberton to try to develop Canada's first geothermal power plant. And I guess without sugarcoating it, was a technical failure. Five wells, and $30 million later, and none of the wells were able to produce the hot water that was needed. So we sold that property or those investigation rights to the private sector. That particular site has changed hands many times over the years, but it still looks like the best potential geothermal resource in the province. It's generically referred to as Meager Creek on Meager Mountain, and the current holders of the rights there are actively trying to develop that site. So yes, I think it's fair to say that it has been overlooked in large part because we haven't needed new resources and we've had better options. In the modern era where the load is growing, on the energy front, I think that wind and solar still are the best bets to meet our energy needs. We have lots of wind in the province. Maybe the solar isn't quite as good, but we certainly have lots of it. So in order to meet the growing energy demand, it looks like wind is going to be the right thing to keep our focus on for the next probably 15 to 20 years. On the capacity side, the question is very different. Most of the world is building new gas resources, even a return to coal resources, in order to meet the dependable capacity requirements, the sorts of things you need to balance increasing wind and make sure you have enough energy available for either your summer peak if you're in California or the winter peak here in the Pacific Northwest. We in British Columbia don't have new gas as a viable option by policy. Other jurisdictions are looking at nuclear, whether that's the conventional old-fashioned type or the newfangled small modular reactors through pilot projects. Again, in British Columbia, we don't have nuclear as an option by virtue of policy. Large hydro would be the next place to look, but again, there's no new large hydro in BC available to us by policy. So what else is there? Geothermal is, I think, a very attractive option in light of the paucity of alternatives we have to meet capacity requirements. I think this is the right time for us to think about geothermal, and I think it's now getting its very close look. I think you would have seen some reports in the public that BC Hydro, in order to advance our capacity needs over the long term, we're going to build the last of our expansions of our existing large hydro system, and then we are open for business. We will be actively looking for new capacity-based resources. We scanned the market last year through what was called the request for expressions of interest for new capacity resources, and we heard quite a few from geothermal developers. And so we are quite interested to see how we can make geothermal happen. Maybe from a utility perspective, I'll talk about how geothermal happens, at least from the BC Hydro point of view. We're not a developer of new resources. Fundamentally, we're the buyer of the output of the projects. So our task is really to set up either a market or a structure where we can facilitate those projects to reach a point where they can sell us their power. Geothermal faces a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma. Geothermal requires a lot of upfront investment in exploration and drilling in order to prove you have a resource. Those are the efforts we made in the 1980s here at BC Hydro, and it didn't pan out. But those are necessary investments in order to prove you have a resource to sell to BC Hydro. But how do you drum up the money to drill those wells and explore those sites if you don't have BC Hydro already on board to buy your power? So a bit of a chicken and egg. How to break that chicken and egg is obviously where is the answer to what it will take from the utility perspective. We have one very nice resource very close to our load center here in the lower mainland. It looks like the logical first place to start. And I also realize that that particular site has lots of potential beyond just the conventional geothermal. It is very hot under Meager Mountain, so hot that there's probably lots of opportunities for more enhanced or adventurous geothermal to get beyond the current 700 megawatts around the province. So I think its time is due. I won't say that it's been overlooked historically. We did our best. There were other alternatives, but now geothermal looks like the best of the bunch of the options we have here in BC. I'm very eager to see it move forward. The chicken or egg problem is the one I think we next need to crack. I think I'll leave it at that, Guy, and pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Alex. So yes, our next speaker is Roland. There's Roland. Yeah, got you right. Yes, indeed. So Roland Horn is a professor of earth sciences at Stanford, and a senior fellow in the Precourt Institute for Energy. He's a former president of the International Geothermal Association and has served as technical program chair of the World Geothermal Congress for several years. And you've been living and dreaming and thinking geothermal a long time, Roland. Over to you.
Very good. So thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about enhanced geothermal systems, which I think is, at least in the United States and probably many other places too, the path that we have to much wider expansion. And it's been an idea that's been around for a long time. So I've sort of titled my short address here, "Are we there yet?" And I will answer that question a bit later. So just a quick snapshot, first of all, about geothermal overall, whether it's been forgotten. There are certainly places in the world where geothermal hasn't been forgotten and has made very important contributions to their national energy grid. And you can see from this graph right up there at the top, Kenya as a nation actually gets about half of its electricity from geothermal. And there are several countries that get a quarter, a third, etc., including New Zealand, which is where I'm originally from. And switching to my environment here in California, California's had geothermal for a long time, and actually we are producing about 6% of the electricity in the state of California from geothermal. And our neighbors in Nevada producing now almost 10%. They're up to 9.7 in 2024. And that's a significant point in the case of Nevada, because the quality, the temperature of the resources in Nevada are significantly less than those in California. Our developed resources in California have temperatures around 250 degrees. Nevada has 150 degrees. So the point there is, if they can do it in Nevada, they can do it in many places. I won't go into the reasons why they've been so successful, but actually, regulatory support and embrace from their state government is one of the reasons why. Coming back to California, but this is a picture of renewable energy alone generated in California over the last 40 years or so. And although you can see it's changed very significantly recently, with wind and solar taking over as the major sources of renewable energy, that red bar is geothermal. And if you do a bit of mental integration of that picture, what you will recognize is that the majority of renewable energy generated in the state of California over the last 40 years came from geothermal. So that was then, but how about now? So we kind of in a static state in both California and Nevada. We are still developing resources, but in a small way. In order to go further and faster with geothermal, we need to move into environments that are not so geologically advantageous as the ones that we've had so far. So we need heat, water, and we need permeability. And in most parts of the subsurface, we have the first two. And what's missing is permeability. So the whole concept of enhanced geothermal system is to create permeability where there is none or where there's insufficient. And that's done using the process of fracturing. And if we look at the United States in terms of target for enhanced geothermal systems, just looking at temperature, this is a map that we made at Stanford of the lower 48. This is a map made up from more than 500,000 wells, most of them oil and gas, but this allowed us to map the subsurface in 3 dimensions. And this is 7 kilometers depth. Modern drilling can reach that depth without too much problem. And just for reference, the kind of resources that are developed commercially and making money in Nevada are at 150 degrees, which is that kind of straw yellow color. And what you can see from this map is we have those temperatures attainable pretty much over the whole of the lower 48. Obviously better in the west coast, and as it happens also in the Gulf of Mexico, but basically everywhere. But, having temperature isn't the whole picture. It's certainly technically feasible to do EGS pretty much across the lower 48. The question is whether or not we could do that at commercially attractive rates. So these are the estimates of the cost of electricity across using the same maps, but also combining that with modeling of the power plants, the distance to transmission, etc. And for reference, that it varies a lot, but nationwide, the average price of electricity in the US is about $70 per megawatt hour, which is kind of in, right down at the bottom of this scale. It's sort of red and orange. And again, you can see Western states, Gulf of Mexico, can make money with EGS, but all of the blues and greens, it's technically feasible, but not commercially possible. Well, not competitive anyway. So let me show you this picture of us. This is our geothermal program at Stanford in 2016. It happens to be this picture. And the reason I show it, our research has been on enhanced geothermal system for a couple of decades, actually. But I wanted to draw your attention to the man in the middle, the tall one in the red shirt. His name is Jack Norbeck. And this is Jack Norbeck with another of his fellow Stanford students, Tim Latimer, who in 2017 founded a company called Fervo Energy, which is a big story in the geothermal picture today. This is kind of a Silicon Valley story that we're kind of accustomed to around Stanford. A couple of guys in their 20s, dig in and change the world, which these two guys have certainly done. And what Fervo did was to address enhanced geothermal systems in a new way. There's been, probably 15, 16 EGS projects around the world over the last 50 years, since the first one in New Mexico by Los Alamos, who invented the idea. But they all followed kind of the same playbook. Fervo threw away that playbook, and instead of drilling vertical wells as everyone else had done, kind of adapted the ideas from shale drilling and drilled horizontal wells with multi-stage fracturing. They actually did several other innovative things too, but this is their principal deviation from what people had done before. And in addition to that, they brought into the geothermal space the drilling optimization that had been achieved in, again, shale oil, shale gas drilling. So this graph shows you a comparison between drilling experience at Fervo's project in Nevada that they call Project Red, compared to the existing field that they kind of went alongside, which is called Blue Mountain. So the thin lines up on the top were the drilling experience at Blue Mountain before, and then the thicker lines are Fervo's drilling experience. And you can see, drilling in geothermal is hard because the rocks are harder, they're more abrasive, and they're at high temperature. So, 40, 60 days is not unusual for a conventional geothermal well. And the first couple of horizontal wells that Fervo drilled, although they were much longer, took about that same time also. But as they moved ahead and gained experience doing that, what you can see then is that they have substantially reduced the length of time that they take to drill the wells. And that is an enormous advantage economically for geothermal because, time is money, and most of, or at least half of the cost of almost all geothermal projects is drilling. So if you cut the drilling cost in half, you basically slice off a quarter of the cost of the project. So this is the learning rate. They anticipated doing that, but in fact achieved a much greater learning rate than they had originally put in their business model. So coming back to the map of levelized cost of electricity again, the map I showed you before was, the 2022 drilling rates. This is redrawing the map, taking into account the experience that Fervo and actually Forge also had for drilling. Changes the picture completely. So again, now $70 is the sort of orange color. And although we can't do it everywhere in the United States, you can see that we have lit up a much more significant fraction of this map with those reduced drilling costs. So in summary then, the things that were holding back enhanced geothermal systems have largely all been overcome, achieving sufficient flow rate, etc. And Fervo has 33 megawatt plants, which are almost completed construction and due to go online, the first of them at least, in the next month or so. And this is a picture of one of the EGS sites. They have 3 pads currently, one for each of the power plants, and that power plant under construction. So I will conclude there and turn back to the chair.
There's me chattering away while still muted, and no one's telling me. So our final guest is Markham Hislop. Markham is Western Canada's foremost energy and climate journalist. He conducts audio and video interviews with global experts and writes regular, incisive political analyses on the future of energy in BC, in Canada, and around the world. Markham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thanks to Norm and his team for organizing this forum. I'm going to take a little different approach here than the other speakers, and that is, and I think this is a deficiency in the Canadian national energy conversation. It certainly is in the BC conversation where I happen to live in British Columbia, and that is, why are we doing this in the first place? And that comes down not to supply, because that's what we're talking about here today. It comes to demand. And we're in an energy transition that's very clear. I had the good luck to do some graduate work on this 40 years ago, and so I've had a theoretical framework that's helped me in my energy journalism to understand the transition from combustion and fossil fuels to electricity and electric devices. And the real revolution, in my opinion, in the energy transition is not supply, though there is plenty of transformative technologies, but the real revolution is on the demand side. We can now do things with electric devices we could not do 10, 20, 30 years ago, and so on. And I'm speaking primarily about electric vehicles. So we're electrifying transportation, we're electrifying buildings using heat pumps, and we're beginning to electrify industrial processes, in part with industrial heat pumps, but also other sources of industrial heat. So the issue here is, what is going to be the demand on the grid? And, for example, down in the United States, where you're looking at now, thanks to data centers, probably load growth rates of 3.7% to 5% per year. That's phenomenal growth. And I've sat in on U.S. Energy Association meetings as a journalist panelist. And we've brought on executives, American utility executives, and they got sweat flops, basically, trying to figure out how they're going to generate enough electricity and modernize the grid in a very short time to meet all of this tremendous demand. And we see in China the enormous amount of renewables that have been added, particularly solar, not only onto the grid, but behind the meter as well. And now you're seeing other countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh beginning to copy the Chinese model. And of course, the Chinese have, over the last 15, 20 years, they've scaled up the manufacturing of these technologies to such an extent that not only do they have spare capacity, but they've driven the prices down. So now I think, in my opinion, about 2020 was the inflection point on the S-curve for those technologies, electric technologies, to compete with combustion technologies. And they've only gotten better. They've only gotten low. Their costs have dropped. And there's plenty of innovation to go around. And so the message here for Canadians is switch, electrify the economy, not tomorrow, we don't flick a switch, but between now and 2050, we need to electrify demand. We need to electrify transportation, buildings, and industry in order to be competitive. And, we're talking about now exporting more of our goods to Asia and perhaps to Europe. And so we need to be as competitive as possible. And so when I look at address this question, it's how do we modernize our grids? It's the same thing the Americans are grappling with now. We should be thinking about that and should have been thinking about it a long time ago. And I would argue that, in fact, the success of our grids, because we're, like 84% cleaned thanks to hydro and the nukes and wind and solar, We're already a very clean grid. We're very dependable and we're very low cost. But and I'm going to push back a little bit against some of Alex's points. The very things that have been successful in the past in British Columbia are now a liability. Because remember, Norm, the last forum we had, and Glenn Clark was here, former premier, chair of BC Hydro, and he said BC Hydro wants a monopoly on geothermal. Absolutely not. If you want innovation to die, give it to a utility. That is, I think, incumbents always inhibit disruptive innovations. There's plenty of theory about this, Clay Christensen from Harvard, and so on. What we need is more innovation. And in the geothermal space, Canada is in a very unique position. And I've done a number of interviews with Ever Technologies out of Calgary, which is closed loop geothermal. And they just finished their first commercial project in Germany. Now they're looking at getting into the American market. They're not looking at getting into the Canadian market, despite the fact, and this is really significant from my point of view, they draw on oil sands drilling technology to create their, basically their underground radiators, where they're joining up laterals at, very significant depths to create a radiator. And not only have they done that, so it's homegrown technology, it's a homegrown company, but their business model is to license that technology to other drilling companies rather than trying to expand and, basically take over, expand by exporting their technology and their people and so on to other markets. So what a great opportunity for Canada. And, that's something that maybe, they're right next door to British Columbia. And if there's ever an opportunity to test a technology and get it into the grid, this is it. And so I would argue that Canada needs to, first of all, increase the pace at which we're electrifying. We brag about this all the time in British Columbia, how we're leading, the country. Well, that's a very poor yardstick if you're measuring electrification. Like 3.5% of the BC auto fleet is electric. Only 10% of homes in British Columbia have heat pumps. I'm one of them, and I love it. It's a great technology. My house is entirely electric. So we need to do it quicker, which then leads to higher load growth. And we know BC Hydro in its integrated resource plan is only planning for 1.4% load growth per year. That's far, far less. And it illustrates the problems we had with very slow electrification of the economy. So I would argue speed up electrification, plan for higher load growth, maybe 2.5%, and then figure out where geothermal, especially closed loop geothermal, other advanced geothermal technologies, can fit into that plan. As it stands now, BC is taking a very conservative, almost a laggard approach to this. It is not an innovator. It is not an early adopter. The most generous thing I could say is it's a late majority adopter. And that is really the problem that we have to confront. It's not, from my point of view, it's not about whether geothermal works or not. That issue is settled. It's the bigger policy questions and strategy questions about where we're going with the economy and what kind of a grid we need to get there.
Thanks, Malcolm. So there's a lot of ideas up in the air. Lots of things, whether it's specific to British Columbia, the innovation from California, the potential globally, the urgent need to get off fossil fuels. Charlotte, you've been listening to the speakers from a British perspective. What goes through your mind as you hear Malcolm, Alex, and Roland talking?
Thanks, Guy. I think there's some similar issues, and there's also some extreme envy of Fervo. We would love Fervo in the UK. And we realize how much that project has done to, reduce the costs of installing geothermal. And that map was fantastic. I've not seen those two map comparators before, and it really spells out a message about how much that project has achieved in reducing the costs. And we'd love to do that. And the project we have in Cornwall that has recently established, and there are more planned, want to do similar, but we don't have the rigs, for example. So we would have to bring them in from somewhere else. So it's a conversation about whether we do that all in one go and do some strategic drills right across the UK. I think in terms of what Markham was saying, in terms of the deployment environment, and I was very interested in the comment about incumbents inhibiting innovation. I wrote that down because I hadn't really thought about it that way, but we do see quite a bit of that, but I've never really had it spelled out for me in that way before. So thank you. That's definitely food for thought to take away. But I think we haven't got clear decisions in the UK. We haven't had a clear energy policy for decades. We don't have a clear energy strategy. There's a lot of red tape in trying to get projects through. The EGS project that we do have took probably 20 years from start to finish. So I think there's a lot of commonality in the challenges we face, but there's a lot of progress we can learn from as well.
That's great, fascinating. Feel free to question each other, but Roland, I have a question for you. Whether you're the breakthroughs that Fervo's doing, have you talked to Mark Jacobson, who's also at Stanford, I believe, with his map for every nation of the world with 100% renewables, excluding he's all wind and solar basically, and efficiency. How does he react when you want him to integrate geothermal into his mapping, Roland? You're muted. Yeah. Can you unmute? Yeah, there you go.
Yes, thank you. Mark Jacobson is a colleague of mine. He's in the civil engineering, different department, but same school. Yes, you're right. He is a proponent of, I forget what he calls it, the WW,
Yeah,
which is
wind and water
hydro.
solar,
Yeah,
WWS.
so, but he doesn't, he's famous for that, but he doesn't ignore geothermal. So he's fully aware of the concept of geothermal, and he and I have had several conversations. And in his more recent papers, he does include geothermal. So in terms of seeking 100% renewables, which countries, actually British Columbia sounds is almost reaching. New Zealand actually also is 85% renewable, fully renewable electricity. Geothermal actually provides a very important component of that, as does hydro, because of the intermittency issue. So, the availability of clean, firm power is something that geothermal can contribute to a portfolio of renewables. And he does include that.
Yeah. Thanks. Do you have questions you want to ask each other, panelists?
Okay, well, I'm going to jump right in then.
Go for it. Go for it.
My question is to Alex. Alex, you heard me offer some criticism of BC Hydro and particularly my pushback against Glenn Clark's comments in the last panel we did, and the slow rate of load growth, I would say tepid approach to this, and Mr. Clark also mentioned that when BC government doesn't give hydro direction, hydro gives BC government direction, which made me shudder, to be honest, apropos of my comments about incumbents and innovation. So, Alex, where do you see the BC grid and BC hydro going in the next 10 to 20, 25 years?
Well, that's a tough one, Mark. I mean, and who am I to disagree with my board chair? but where are we going in the next 10 to 20 years? You're absolutely right, and you did quote the less than 2% annual growth, and that's our reference load forecast. That's our best guess based on a number of factors. We talked about electrification of built environment, transportation, and industry. It's industry that's the big thing that's growing most of the change there. The built environment here in BC, to the degree it electrifies, actually a lot of it is a good news story for the utility. If you electrify a heat pump that displaces electric baseboard heater, that actually reduces our annual load because of the efficiencies of the heat pump. But you're right, as you fuel switch from a natural gas-based heating system to a heat pump, that increases our load. When it comes to the transport place, that really does depend on the light duty vehicle transition to batteries. That has come and gone and come and gone. It's hard to say exactly what course it's going to take. It's still fairly dependent on public subsidies, and when those come and when those go really changes how we think the electrification of transport is changing. Both of those two things really drive our need for capacity in the South Coast. So where Vancouver and Victoria are, those two particular drivers really change the nature of our grid and how we need to support it. It means we need to build transmission, it means we need to find resources in a particular location. But the scale of growth there is pretty much dwarfed by what happens in the industrial sector. What happens in the oil and gas in the Northeast, and when they electrify, they add hundreds of megawatts of load. What happens in the North Coast when an LNG facility gets built, those can be an extra gigawatt of new load. For some context, our largest customers in the province today, largely pulp and paper facilities or companies in the biomass sector, our largest customers consume about 150 megawatts. The new AI data centers that are coming around North America or LNG facilities are in the gigawatt scale. So a totally different sort of customer than we have ever seen and introduce an entirely new challenge. I think, from my point of view, the make or break load that will impact our load forecast is what happens in the industrial sector and the degree that that electrifies. How will we meet that challenge is a tough one, Markham. Those loads are not in Vancouver and Victoria. Those are either in the hinterlands of the Northeast, like the Montney region, where we have a lot of available shale gas, or in the North Coast, where we have the potential for new LNG facilities, again, massive new facilities, and AI data centers throw in the wild card of being able to locate wherever they can find a place on the grid to connect.
I'd like to just respond to that for a moment.
Sure.
Thank you,
Sure,
Alex.
Markham, go ahead.
And one of the advantages of Evera's technologies, and I'm sure there are other geothermal models that do this as well, but the ability to locate the generation right next to the load, because Evera's technology relies upon the heat from the rock heating up the water inside the pipe, as opposed to finding pools of reservoirs of hot water. There's pretty much hot rock everywhere. And so what you can do, and I understand the cost and the risk for BC Hydro in building out grid infrastructure, out into these remote areas, like the Montney, for example. And so one of the solutions might be an Ever-like geothermal project where you put it right close to the wells, or you put it close to the processing plant, or whatever it happens to be. And so what you're looking at is reasonably priced power. The CEO quoted me $65 a megawatt hour. I'm not sure they're there yet, but that's where they're headed, he says, which is reasonable for clean dispatchable power. It's right on site. It's dispatchable, so it's non-intermittent. There's a lot of advantages to that, and I'm kind of curious if you've looked at that model for serving industrial loads in remote locations.
Yep. Thanks. A great fit for the industrial load, like you said. And if they were to deliver at $65 a megawatt hour, I would take it every single time. For some context, our last call for power resulted in wind power coming in at about $75 a megawatt hour. We think that's kind of the benchmark price for energy. Bear in mind, if you buy geothermal at that same price, you're also getting a lot more, like dependable capacity, like avoiding batteries that back up those wind. So they're not an apples to apples comparison. But believe me, if you could get below $100 a megawatt hour, that would be a great deal. I don't think they're anywhere close at this point, Markham, to be fair. The conventional geothermal is nowhere close to $100 a megawatt hour from what I can see in BC. So there's a ways to go. That would be great. Bearing in mind that what I think about the enhanced geothermal, and again, if it could be located anywhere, wonderful. We are seeing the Googles and the data centers investing in both enhanced geothermal as well as SMR resources that they can locate to avoid the grid congestion they're otherwise facing. A new AI data center often has a 10-year wait to get connection to the transmission grid. Certainly that's the case in the US, in many locations in the US. Rather than wait 10 years to get a connection to the grid and also get offered low price power, they're just building their new generation resources and going off grid. Again, I'll introduce the problem of scale here. A new LNG facility can represent a gigawatt of new load. If the existing Fervo facilities are offering 33 megawatts each, I wonder if they are nearly energy dense enough to support the kind of new loads that we're looking at. A gigawatt is a massive enterprise that frankly requires a part of a province rather than a part of an underground reservoir to serve. So we are looking to serve those large gigawatt scale loads through transmission and essentially leveraging our large hydro system and augmenting it by more wind. But we would love to see a non-location specific renewable capacity resource that's available 24/7 in the same way that LNG facilities consume power 24/7. It's a wonderful fit. Lots of promise. I think on the price front, they're still a decade away.
Thanks. So, a question on a different curve. Here in British Columbia, we have pushback from the gas industry against the development of renewable energy in two ways. The first is that when it comes to heat pumps and our desire that every new house should be all electric and not gasified, the Fortis BC or Fortis Canada has been constantly lobbying local governments to say, oh, pay no attention to them, the building, and it'll cost too much, and all sorts of excuses to keep bringing gas. Their whole business case depends on gas. They refuse to turn themselves into an energy services company, selling efficiency and stuff like that. And at the other end of the scale, we have these huge LNG big American Wall Street corporations pushing these huge LNG projects. And look, Roland, when I looked at your data around the carbon footprint of the LNG, it is massive. It's worse than coal, and yet we're pushing it in a BC government that supposedly is all for climate action and saying we have the best climate action plan in North America. Are you getting, Roland, in California, do you get pushback from the gas industry trying to slow down and tell nonsense about geothermal and stuff like that, so just to muddy the waters?
I don't believe so. I think it was Charlotte who was showing the figures for the gas for LNG.
Sorry, say that again. I missed the biggest what?
It was Charlotte showing you the figures
It
for
was
the
Charlotte's
gas
figures.
emissions.
Yes, that's right. Yes, right. Yeah.
But in answer to your question, I think the producers or the generators are looking for. I mean, we don't have much of a gas industry in California. We import gas also from Texas through a very long pipe. So people are looking specifically in California to actually avoid that. But because of the high degree of renewables or variable renewables we have on our grid in California, we're currently dependent on gas for filling in the gap in the afternoon in the duck curve.
Yeah. So another question, does the fall in price in battery storage technology create competition against geothermal for firm power?
Not it does. I mean, yes and no. I mean, we have 8 gigawatts of battery going onto the grid 3 o'clock every afternoon in California. Um, and in many ways, that's a technology which is useful for geothermal as well, because actually, conventional NEGS systems and are not as flexible as other sources like hydro, for example, and therefore batteries are likely to be useful and are now being deployed also for geothermal. The point of the matter in the end, though, is that solar PV plus batteries, despite the massive reduction in costs of both of them, together are about the same price as geothermal.
Hmm.
So geothermal has a larger capital upfront cost, but in terms of LCOE, over the life of the project, they now come down almost to par.
Is California doing things around tax credits and tax deferments or stuff like that that'll advantage investors in a way that might be beneficial to us in British Columbia?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Because I understand that this dilemma around the big upfront capital costs when you don't know what you're going to get and the risk that investors are putting in. Anyone got a response to this, the financial capitalist, well, the investment question? It's not a capitalist question, it's an investment question, right? Malcolm, what's your experience tell you about the need of investors to make progress in this?
Before I answer that, Guy, I want to go
Yeah.
back and address an issue that came up previously, which is LNG expansion in British Columbia.
Yeah.
Again, this is a case where British Columbia and Canadians are not, they look at supply. We have lots of cheap gas in BC and Alberta, and they conclude that therefore we should turn it into LNG and sell it onto international markets. It is a fantasy. And I'll give you the numbers. Last year, there were 585 billion cubic meters of LNG traded around the world. Between now and 2029, maybe even 2028, there's 300 billion cubic meters more of new LNG supply coming on from mostly low-cost producers like Qatar, Australia, United States, and others. The IEA said very clearly last year in its World Energy Outlook, it said, we don't know where the customers are coming from. We're going to have a glut of LNG for decades because we just don't have enough customers to take all of that production. And I interviewed Mike Farrell from Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, who said very clearly that maybe one plant would be built in British Columbia. It'd be the Cy Lisham's plant. And that's not even a sure thing. And the rest of them, you can forget about it. So I would say, and Alex, I'm going to put the finger on you. BC Hydro, along with the government and along with the business community, have been listening to the wrong people. They haven't been paying attention to their customers. They always look at the supply side of things. And so planning an expansion of the electricity system around a fever dream is very, very bad policy, in my opinion.
So we could easily get hijacked onto internal British Columbia stuff here, and we want to focus on geothermal. Gary Gumley, do you want to turn your camera on and ask your question about the contrast between what's happening in Cornwall in England and the Hecate Strait off Haida Gwaii? Gary, or shall I read it out for you?
I can just speak quickly. I just did some. Thank you, Charlotte. By the way, I hope you noticed that our Queen Charlotte Strait fault line is what we're talking about here in BC. I've always been fascinated by the Hecate Strait for wind power as well as the geothermal. But I'm wondering, and I'm doing research on this, I'm wondering if anybody's got any comments about the potential of water-based geothermal and how challenging it may or may not be.
By water-based, do you mean drilling in the ocean for geothermal?
Yeah, in the Hecate Strait.
So for viewers, Hecate Strait is the water between the mainland of British Columbia and the islands of Haida Gwaii. Yeah.
Yes, it actually is northern Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii, that whole area.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I'm wrong. Okay. Ronan, do you have any knowledge or experience about ocean-based geothermal drilling?
I don't know that people have, I mean, people have been talking about that for quite a long time, but the whole issue with geothermal is its cost. You have to get the cost down to absolutely the minimum you can. And anytime you do something offshore, that's added cost. And I don't think that's going to be economic anytime soon. We do have offshore wells actually in the Salton Sea in California, but that's only because the resource underlies them. And they're drilling in basically 5 feet of water. It's not really offshore at all. I would like to sort of respond to the comments about closed loop if you have time for that.
Sure.
So, closed loop is the alternative to EGS, and Malcolm has introduced it. And I think it's important to sort of clarify that closed loop is nothing like the promise that people are making it out to be. I mean, we're talking about an order of magnitude greater cost than EGS or conventional. And in spite of the fact that it's technically feasible with actually some rather clever technology, the reason it doesn't work, I mean, it does work, but the reason it doesn't make economic sense is because it depends on conduction through rock. And rocks are basically insulators. The way that EGS and conventional geothermal works is you're passing water through the fractures of the rock and you get in contact with cubic kilometers of rock. If you're trying to extract the heat with a pipe which is this big from a cubic kilometer of rock, the only way that you can make it work is to drill hundreds of kilometers of laterals, which is technically feasible, but it just costs a lot of money. So, at the moment, there's no visible path to economic viability for closed loop. And I should also stress that this is an idea that has been promoted, or at least talked about, for more than 100 years. There was a paper by Nikola Tesla himself in 1931 who proposed closed-loop geothermal. I myself worked on it in the 1980s and quickly discovered with simple calculations that it doesn't make sense. The same has been true in Japan and several other places. And there's been at least three um, former closed-loop projects, which hopefully look
Yeah.
forward to the calculations not being correct, but it turned out actually that they were.
So, Roland, I remember when enhanced geothermal first came on the scene, yeah, maybe 20 years ago. Um, Soon after that, there was a project in Switzerland which led to some mini earthquakes and stuff like that. And so there's a fear in the air, like, where do we stand on the earthquake risk of enhanced geothermal and what Alex called adventurous geothermal?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So induced seismicity is absolutely an issue for EGS and sometimes actually for conventional geothermal too. There was an even worse case than Switzerland, which was in Korea, in Pohang, where they had a very large earthquake, which was, unequivocally associated with the EGS project, which caused a lot of damage and injured people. So, I mean, you will never going to see EGS in Korea ever in the future until people have forgotten that. So it's an absolutely an issue. Um, and the point of the matter, the analogy I like to give is lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries 20 years ago used to catch fire a lot. That didn't mean that we abandoned lithium-ion batteries, which is a wonderful technology that we depend on every day. The point then was to address by research, how do you stop them from catching fire a lot? And that is this issue. That's the path that we're on now for EGS. Induced seismicity does happen. It is a problem, and we have to address it, and we have to find ways to ameliorate it. And we have some good progress in that direction. Also, what we see now is that at least in the early stages, and this is likely to be the case for 10, 20 years, the projects that we're seeing in the United States are kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and that's intentionally so. Drilling a well in downtown Basel was probably, not the best idea, and we could probably do EGS in Manhattan or downtown Los Angeles, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So doing it in safe locations is a good starting point for that.
Does that lead to a catch-22 though, that you want your geothermal close to where the demand is, and you have to build extensive grid extensions to get to those remote areas where no one's going to worry if there's a mini earthquake. So does that add to the cost of geothermal, the grid extension?
It does. So we actually did some calculations of that. It adds about 10% to do it distant from your demand sources. But now we're talking about different kinds of demand sources. You could actually move your data centers out in the middle of the desert as well, and that would be just fine. And
Right.
we have major, transmission corridors which go through remote areas. You basically just build your project under the power line or alongside.
Yeah. So it's here in British Columbia, Meager Creek, where our potential is in winter, a snowy area, and there's a lot of skiing going on up there. Alex or Roland, if there were to be drilling in Meager Creek and it led to mini earthquakes, could it cause avalanches or increase avalanche risk and put the skiers at risk and stuff like that?
Well, Meager Creek is well-known landslide area. In fact, a major landslide happened just a few years ago, taking out a bridge in one of the road access points. So it is no doubt a risk. Um, I think it's a risk everywhere. Although Meager Creek won't involve fracturing. At least that's not the plan that I understand. It's a conventional resource. The right geology to have a high degree of permeability and very high temperatures at relatively low depths make it the right place to start without, again, I guess adventurous is just the word that I chose, but conventional geothermal, notionally the least cost type of geothermal, especially with a temperature like that. But it's certainly something to be concerned about. More the landslide than induced seismicity.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous mountainside to work on.
So,
I'd
so
I'd, I'd love to talk about costs because I think that's the relevant component here. And Guy, you mentioned about the investment challenge. As I think about the costs for geothermal, there's the costs of drilling, and I think we've heard a fair bit today that advances in the oil and gas sector are driving the costs of drilling down, and that's great. There's the cost of financing, and I'll put it this way again: the chicken or egg. I mentioned the high upfront costs and the high technical risk, meaning that the person who's putting up the money say $50 million to do the exploration drilling requires a 30% return on that money in order to justify the level of risk they're taking. So that's an additional cost at the end of the day. Is there some way to either share that risk, take that risk publicly, like is often done through loan guarantees and the like, to reduce the ultimate cost down the road? And then there's the improvement of the resource itself. The hotter it is, the better, and so there's the fracking or the enhancement that makes that a potential. But for the good old fashioned conventional resource, it's still a little bit more expensive than something like a good small storage hydro alternative here in BC, but I think it's getting very close. I wonder if there's any comments here on how perhaps advancing conventional geothermal here in BC anyway can help learn some things so that we can down the road get enhanced geothermal cheaper and cheaper. How do we address the cost question?
Just for contrast, what are you paying for imported utility scale solar projects at the moment? Megawatts hour?
For imports, you mean?
No, no, made in BC. You said wind was selling at around 75. What's utility solar selling for?
A little bit higher than that, but when we did a call in 2024, the 9 winning projects, 8 of them are wind, 1 of them was solar, so the solar was at the end of the list there, but in the same sort of ballpark.
Because you mentioned that geothermal was up around $100. That was
if it were, I would love that.
Okay.
We don't know. We have no geothermal here, nor have we had a successful bid for geothermal. They in speaking to the developers geothermal, the structure of our calls for power, where it is where Hydro says, come on, come all, give us your best price for power. They have a competition and we buy them essentially on price. That structure isn't conducive for geothermal to bid. They just have to put too much money up front in order to develop a bid, as opposed to a wind developer who can put up a met tower, collect data for a little bit, spend money to engage the First Nations, and that's all they really need to prepare a bid. But our current structure for acquisitions is not fit for purpose for something like geothermal.
So Roland, with the 2 young men in California, your colleagues at Stanford, who's founded Fervo, were they just able to get in on Silicon Valley fever and Stanford investment fever to, something new and exciting and shiny, throw money at and got lucky? Or is it, how did they address the capital investment challenge, the big upfront cost?
So they did go the kind of venture capital route, but they kind of happened on a fortunate moment of history in that, we have this big expansion of demand from the kind of companies that, made Silicon Valley, the data centers, etc. And many of them, Google, Meta, etc., have a corporate passion for, clean energy. So, they were willing to, at least initially, make philanthropic, contributions to that development to make it happen. And then quickly sort of moved in, realizing that it looked like it, was actually going to work with real investment money. So they've had money from the, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is Microsoft. But importantly, also too, they're getting a lot of nowadays investment from companies like Devon, which is an independent oil company, Shell, and they're selling actually PPAs to utilities. So, the conventional, sort of old-fashioned, that I shouldn't say that, traditional, energy companies are making these investments now, but they did start with Silicon Valley sort of VC money.
Yeah.
Not actually VC money, but actually corporate money.
Yeah. Charlotte, how does the investment scene work in Britain? It's 35 years since I left Britain. I'm not familiar with how the electricity market's been divvied up under neoliberal stuff anymore, but do you need a private investor and a private company to do the geothermal? Or is the talk of nationalizing the grid that people like Zach Polanski talk about, is that going to work in favor of geothermal? Or how does it fit into Britain's energy future?
Yeah, I think at the moment it is challenging. Obviously, we've only got one project that's recently now producing geothermal electricity, and that was able to apply for what we call our contract for difference, which offers a guaranteed price to the producer and the customer for electricity produced. And that was typically established to service our growing wind industry. But the people at Geothermal Engineering that did this project in Cornwall were very persistent, and I've spent a lot of time, and I've actually got geothermal through this contract for difference, so they will get payment for their electricity, and I think securing that contract then enabled them to get some private investment. So I think they got some crowdfunding. They haven't revealed too much of how their funding is made up, but I know they tried some crowdfunding early on. They've got other private investors, and then they've also got some money from our kind of national wealth fund, which has been recently set up by government as well to promote those kind of large scale energy projects. And the reason they were able to get that as well is because they're looking at co-production of lithium. So that has also enabled a bit more investor interest. And so they've got a trial scale lithium plant there, but they have got plans to size up both the power production and the lithium production going forwards. For heat, it's very challenging. The incentives that were there have been largely removed. And I think we do need some things. A lot of the countries in our kind of European neighbours that have done well with geothermal have things like risk insurance schemes or a feed-in tariff for the heat that they produce, or even better access and more open access to data. And those three things really seem to help things move forward. So one of the things we're trying to look at is whether we could have like something to fund that first well gap, because if you're in an unknown area, once you've got the first well drilled, then your second one, depending on what reservoir you're going into, but you might have massively reduced the risks and uncertainty, and you might be able to then attract private investment for that second one. So we're exploring those kind of models at the moment. I must say I'm a hydrogeologist, not a finance expert here. But that's kind of how things have worked in the UK so far.
And for those who don't know, UK politics is itself fracturing with the mainstream parties falling aside. In one amusing scenario, you've got two parties, Reform on the right and the Green Party on the left. If you were advising Zach Polanski, the leader of the Green Party, to develop a really progressive energy policy or electricity policy for Britain, what would you be asking him to do?
I think they need to put together a strategy. They need to set and adopt targets. They need to establish a delivery body for it. And then we need changes to, these kind of policy instruments that could help or be more supportive. And I think actually showing government commitment, a demonstration of government commitment, we're starting to get that now. We have a minister that has been appointed recently for energy, and his background is from one of our very early geothermal schemes in Southampton that was part of a borehole that was drilled in response to the oil crisis back in the 1980s, and there was 8 or 9 drilled, and that is one that's taken forward into a scheme and has worked on and off ever since. So those are some of the key things I think we'd ask for. What we have found, because I sit in County Durham in the north of England, that was taken on by Reform through the elections this year. And I did wonder, obviously, how that would impact on some of the projects that I knew the local authority there were working on. And they're very keen on geothermal because of the energy sovereignty and taking back control of our energy supply point of view. They're actually very receptive to it. So we've found it quite positive, which is, for different reasons, but
yeah,
still supportive of it.
Thanks. So, Roland, as we begin to wrap up, on the global scene, you're active with the global congresses. How are discussions in other countries? I mean, Russia, take an example, is just all fossil fuel and corruption all over the place. They must have geothermal resources in a country as large as Russia. How does it fit into the picture?
Yes, they do. Actually, there are some significant geothermal developments actually in Russia, in Kamchatka. So it's a volcanic region, also on the Rim of Fire, just a little bit left of you guys. So for them, that's an important resource because it's a very isolated region.
And how about China?
China doesn't have particularly good geothermal resources because their temperatures aren't very high, except in Tibet, where 1/3 of the electricity comes from geothermal for the Tibet region. But China has a widespread application of direct heat. So, in Tianjin and Xiang'an, which is a new city they actually intentionally built around a place where they could do geothermal district heating. So they're totally committed to it, as well as beginning now to look for places where they can do electricity as well. They don't have very many of them, so their focus is on direct heat.
So in the World Geothermal Congress, do you have separate streams dealing with conventional and enhanced geothermal and the district heat geothermal, which is more shallow heating buildings, seen of things, very different technologies, right?
All of the above. So the World Geothermal Congress covers many things, including balneology and cultural uses. And let's not fail to notice that the next World Geothermal Congress is going to be right there in Canada,
Mm.
in Calgary, just in about 4 weeks from now.
Wow. And while we're on the global topic, is there geothermal potential in Iran that could persuade them to be less obsessed with nuclear?
They also actually operating geothermal fields in Iran as well,
Hmm.
but not very big. I don't think it's going to be large enough to take 10, 20% like in other countries.
I would assume their solar potential is just enormous, though, probably, yeah.
Also good. There's even geothermal in Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia is one massive, great solar farm waiting to be developed, right? Obviously, it bathes in sun 24 hours a day. Well, shouldn't say 24,
Yes,
but 12 hours a day, right?
they're the Saudi Arabia of solar.
Yes. Um, what is the mood in the World Geothermal Congress about the potential for future enhanced and conventional geothermal? Is it upbeat or is it less endlessly grinding your teeth thinking, why can't we get rid of these investment challenges and when do we get a breakthrough? Roland,
So,
you're on the
well, I guess
global.
we'll find out in 4 weeks. My overall sense is that there is, widespread exuberance for geothermal now that we didn't see 10 years ago worldwide. So,
Yeah.
we're not all of the way there yet, but it's certainly looking a lot more promising than it did before. There's a lot more interest. There's a lot better fit for the kind of load that we're seeing. There are technologies and companies and investment enthusiasm that we didn't see before. So it's looking pretty darn good.
So, Alex, do you get a ticket to ride to go to Calgary next month in 4 weeks
It
for
it
BC Hydro?
it happens to coincide with the filing of our IRP to our commission, and so I'm on the
Oh,
stand at that very same time. Otherwise, I
oh
had
my
my
goodness.
ticket.
And we in the West Coast Climate Action Network are one of the interveners on that very file, right? So, any wrap up questions before we close? I see we've lost Marcus. He obviously had to go to another meeting. Any final thoughts?
I don't mind posing a question if you don't mind, Guy.
Please do.
How do we get the first project in British Columbia off the ground? Um, what will it take to get the first one done? Recognizing there'll be a cost premium, so it won't necessarily be economic. But what needs to happen, either among the investment community, the government folks who can either provide some money or take away some barriers, the utility side, what sort of risks do we need to take on that we wouldn't otherwise take? How do we attract the development community who would be wary again from a series of failures of the one particular Meager Creek site here in BC? What are steps one, two, and three that need to happen from any of those players to make it happen?
What's the capital cost of a new drilling experiment at Meaker Creek?
Ballpark guess, and for their first stage, they're looking at about a 40 megawatt gross production facility, 32 megawatts to the grid, and it is approximately $300 million.
That's total project cost, though, right?
That is the total capital cost. That's right.
So the risk cost of drilling and finding you've got nothing there again, what is that cost?
Between 75 and 100 million.
Yeah, so I can't see the BC government getting too excited when they're stretching themselves under limits of all
Yes,
kinds.
hard to get capital grants out of the province. The federal government through NRCan has long had a very strong interest in providing money to geothermal developers, but usually capped at about $50 million and always requiring matching private sector funds. It's frankly that $50 million of private sector funds that is the real challenge.
Yeah. Roland, could you send some of your Stanford billionaires up our way?
Oh, but yes.
So, Charlotte, any final closing thoughts?
Thanks, Guy. Yes, I think I wanted to give a bit of context maybe. And we mentioned seismicity earlier, and obviously Roland was giving some examples of the potential there. And it's something that obviously we've experienced in the Cornwall area with the drilling that's gone on down there, because, you know, you do something to the earth, it reacts. We've seen it in the mines when the mines were pumped down and worked. We've seen regional areas where the subsurface has moved down and subsequently reinflates after pumps are switched off and water levels recover. So I think there's a lot to be done on the public engagement. We've had some really good exemplars on the Cornwall projects, you know, working with people, because seismicity was triggered when they were drilling, as you would expect. But people were aware of what was going on and they kept people informed about it. So there's some really good exemplary work there. And we've been talking more recently about, obviously, shale gas exploration was shut down in the UK following seismicity in the northwest of England. And that was due to, I think, some of the constraints in terms of how much seismicity you were allowed to generate, you know, within limits, which was a follow-on from the incident at Basel. But just to put it into context, we've learned that the Taylor Swift concert in Edinburgh, with everybody jumping up and down and enjoying the show, generated more seismicity than was generated in northwest England that shut down that project. And I'm not talking here about whether shale gas should or should not have gone ahead, because that's a completely different matter. And obviously I'm here to promote geothermal, but it just gives people that bit of context that actually by going out and enjoying ourselves or driving our car, we are making an impact on the earth. So people think of it as a big, terrible thing. And obviously that the incident in Korea was a dreadful incident. But I think we do need to do a lot to give that context about, you know, the severity of things and putting them against real life events as well.
And against the severity of the impact of fossil fuels and the climate crisis and the total catastrophes that are heading our way if we don't get off fossil fuels ASAP.
Yeah. And we talk about the costs of doing geothermal, but what are the costs of not doing it?
Absolutely.
From other perspectives.
Roland, any wrap-up comments?
No, now's the time. Canada should do geothermal too.
Alex, final words to you then. You're muted.
I'm sold. I'm sold. I am very eager to see that first project, realizing there's like a strange souffle. Many things have to come together at all at the same time in order for it to work. And you know, it's hard for BC Hydro as a utility who really has a cost conscious frame on energy acquisitions. Where do we play our part? I think that's the big challenge for me.
Yeah. And we need a new metaphor for geothermal, not to get off the ground, but something similar. I can't quite work it out yet. Well, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Marcus, for being here. And I hope we've all learned more about geothermal, and we'll keep on learning. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.